This is an address to the nation by the Prime Minister, Julia Gillard.
Good evening. I want to talk to you tonight about why the government is putting a price on carbon.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
We've had a long debate about climate change in this country.
You've been saying that the political response to climate change is a global conspiracy to create a one world government, the same sort of sentiment we heard from John.
Well, no, I didn't say it was a conspiracy to create a world government. I said there is a treaty draft in which it was very clear that a government, and the word was used in that context for the first time that I've ever seen in an international treaty, a world government was going to be created. It was going to be given overarching powers to control the economies, to tax nations that belong to the Framework Convention on Climate Change. This was a major grab for power by bureaucratic centralists, and they had actually put a treaty draft through which had gone through several negotiating rounds, and not one Western country had taken out the anti-democratic provisions that John Smead has just been talking about.
This notion of world government, though, I mean, it's a pretty controversial term to be throwing around. Why is it any more different than the other global treaties and summits we engage in, and rules and regulations like the World Trade Organization?
Of course, the answer is because of the extraordinary powers it was going to be given. For instance, the right to set all market rules was going to be given to this new world government. There'd be no such thing as a free market anymore. It was
we already have market rules that the world's agreed on through the WTO.
Yes, they do, but those are agreed on as a technocratic thing. Here, they were proposing to give total control of all world markets, not just the very limited role the WTO has, to an unelected authority. Now, I think that if you need a world government, and I think that Australia is a democratic country, then it would prefer that we should, as the peoples of the world, elect that world government when it's going to be given the same powers effectively as a government here, only on a worldwide scale. No taxation without representation, that's the old principle, and democracy is a valuable thing, and I realise that the ABC is not particularly keen on that, but I am, and so are the people of Australia.
Why should Australia not be the centre of what is inevitably going to be a global parliamentary governance down the line, if we human beings are going to live with each other?
We're living through exceptionally difficult times. The financial crisis and its dramatic impact on employment and budgets, the climate crisis which threatens our very survival, a period of anxiety, uncertainty and lack of confidence. Yet these problems can be overcome by a joint effort in and between our countries. 2009 is also the first year of global governance, with the establishment of the G20 in the middle of the financial crisis. The climate conference in Copenhagen is another step towards the global management of our planet.
But we've now had the debate. 2011 is the year we decide that as a nation we want a clean energy future. Now is the time to move from words to deeds.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
You stated in your remarks to the Commonwealth Club in San Francisco that one of the most powerful religions in the Western world is environmentalism. Can you explain why you refer to environmentalism as a religion?
Because I have training in anthropology, the idea that anthropologists have about what constitutes a religion or what functions a religion serves are a little bit different from how you think about it if you categorize religions as, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, something like that. So from the standpoint of an anthropological view, a religion is a collective set of beliefs. There is a leader or leaders who promote the beliefs among the followers. Followers make some kind of contribution or change in their lifestyle based on the religious belief. The religious belief gives them a total view of the world in terms of how the world is structured, what's right, what's wrong, what's good action, what's bad action. That all fits perfectly onto environmentalism. The other thing that environmentalism does, which I said to this group, is that it rather precisely maps a lot of Judeo-Christian beliefs about the origin of the world and so on, so that in environmental thinking there is a view that there used to be a sort of Eden, and then people came and ruined that Eden, and that we are therefore sort of original sinners because we're destroying this planet. And what we can do, however, is get salvation through sustainability. And if you're a good person, you will seek salvation, and if you're a bad person, you'll drive SUVs.
So I've decided most of the money raised from the carbon price will be used to fund tax cuts, pension increases and higher family payments. These will be permanent, matching the carbon price over time. Not everyone will be financially better off. There's no money tree. The budget has to add up. But I want people who need help most to get the help they need.
So I asked the question, what's the point of all of this? This is a redistribution pretending to be compensation. It's a tax increase pretending to be an environmental policy. It's socialism masquerading as environmentalism. That's what this is.
And we are a confident, creative people. I see a great clean energy future for our great country. I know we can get there together.
There will be no carbon tax under the government I lead.
Julia Gillard today announced her carbon dioxide tax package. It's a huge reform, she claims. There's supposed to be pain and there's supposed to be a gain. Now I'll start. As far as the gain's concerned, it's supposed to be cutting the world's temperatures. This won't do it. It never was going to do it. Is entirely futile. Now, that's the gain. Tell us about the pain.
Where do you start trying to analyse something which is such a concoction of insanity and stupidity? I mean, it's sort of so bizarre. It's so Alice in Wonderland. It almost defies any sort of rational attempt to analyse it. Simple points, Andrew. Petrol going to a car, the emissions from petrol going to a car, they're fine. The emissions from petrol going to big and diesel in semi-trailers, that's terrible. It's going to destroy the planet. A ton of coal, of Australian coal going to a local power station to create power, that's terrible. We've got to get rid of it. 10 tonnes of Australian coal going to a Chinese power station to create power, that's wonderful. It's great for the economy. Chinese can have cheap coal-fired power. Australians can't have cheap coal-fired power from their own coal. It's insane.
And then on the other hand, we complain. We think, oh my God, China is so powerful, it's coming in and buying our farmlands. We're choking our development. We're helping them improve theirs. You're going to get more of it. I mean, this is just national suicide to me.
And you go back to the basic. I mean, your lie is it's not going to do anything to cut global temperatures. But the starting point, $23 a tonne, is not a price which is going to change our habits at all. It's too low. The Greens say...
Even the Greens say it.
Garno says it's got to be $40 or more dollars a tonne. So it starts low. So why are the Greens signing on to this? Because you've got this even more absurd, utter fantasy of committing to cutting our emissions by 80%. By 2050. I mean, Julia Gillard, I don't think will be Prime Minister in 2050 or in the election running up to that. I guess, to my mind, the most sensible thing you can say about this is it dismantleable? Can we at some point say, we've woken up to this complete insanity, the rest of the world is not doing anything in this regard, they're all just sitting there watching this. If they watch Australia at all, it'll be saying, when do we send the white people in white coats to take away those crazy people down there that are doing all these absurd things?
I mean, you're left with the choice, aren't you? We're the only country that's got a national carbon dioxide tax being imposed, right? So either we're smarter than the whole world, or the whole world's looking at us thinking we're dumber than everyone else. And I think it's the latter. But the thing is here, Terry, I think it's a double con. If you really do believe man's emissions are threatening the Earth, then this package should outrage you, because it will not do a thing about really cutting emissions in any serious way. It just won't. The Greens admit it. If, on the other hand, you're like me and you're a sceptic, even then you'd be outraged, because even if you did think that man's emission contributed in some way to global warming, nothing's going to happen. Nothing's going to change. This is so small an amount. Nothing.
And there's another element to this. In order to get this no-paying thing through, they are introducing a sensible tax structure. The other side of this element is so-called tax reform, which is the basis for handing back money to low-income earners, so that apart from family payments, so that they won't feel the pain. It's introducing tax reform. We're putting up tax rates. It's not been made clear in the sort of overall stuff, but when you look at the detail, you've got this tax-free threshold, but it's only for people on low incomes, and in order to achieve that, you've got to put up the tax rates above that. So we're going back to higher tax rates, which is the antithesis of tax reform.
Honestly, Terry, if you wanted to believe what some of the world's top climate scientists say, and this is actually an excuse for big government, for a massive redistribution of wealth, whether that was intended or not, that's what it is.
Except I can't sort of get there, Andrew, because it is so inchoate, it's so crazy, it's so incomprehensibly dumb. You can't really attribute some sort of underlying nefarious purpose to it. Another aspect to all this, we've got to trust the Treasury modelling. As the Treasury says, this is not going to make the slightest difference to the economy. The economy is going to power on untouched. Well, you know, maybe you won't be able to have electrical light at home for 24 hours a day, but the economy is going to be untouched. And it says, the wonderful figure that it comes up with, this is going to cost, on average, $9.90 per week. But all this wonderful packages to offset that is going to return $10.10. 20 cents. The Treasury can estimate down to 20 cents a week the net benefit that the average household is going to get. Do you think the average household is going to say, we're going to be 20 cents a week better off? This is absolutely fantastic.
And one other thing before we go, Terry, because we're out of time, but I think there's an incredible repetition of the Telstra deal, where the government with Telstra spent billions to essentially make it rip up a perfectly good network.
Exactly.
This time they're promising to spend an unknown billions, because they haven't said what the figure is, it's not included in the figure, to take out 2,000 megawatts of power. So a perfectly good, cheap power station is going to be commissioned.
And
we're actually
spending
and closed out. We're going to be spending money to destroy another asset. I've never seen anything like it in my life.
Exactly the same as ripping, as you say, ripping out the perfectly good cable that's out there delivering high-speed broadband now. And finally, Andrew, but on the other side of the equation, we're going to pour tens of billions of dollars into quote-unquote renewable energy. It's not dams, that's the only renewable energy that works. It's going to be more and more wind towers, more and more so-called solar farms.
Think it'll work better than pink bats? Well, that was a beauty. But look, Terry, thank you for joining us. Look, that's our view. Maybe you've got a different view, but really, I think this is the greatest act of national suicide I've ever seen. We've gone mad, you know.
Skeptic who travels the world challenging the notion humans are solely responsible. He faces Dr. Richard Dennis, economist, executive director of the Australia Institute and former advisor to the Greens, today at the National Press Club.
Ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon and welcome to the Press Club and today's National Australia Bank address. In fact, it is a debate on climate change, one of the issues that is causing so much controversy with the Australian people as the political debate plays out. But today we are very pleased to bring a debate between Richard Dennis, Dr. Dennis, a former advisor to Democrats leader, one-time Democrats leader Natasha Stott-Despoja. Dr. Dennis is executive director of the Australia Institute and an adjunct professor with the Australian National University. He will be debating Lord Christopher Monckton, a gentleman on his third visit to Australia. It's fair to say, on a tour that has courted some controversy, in fact probably not since Joe Cocker was deported in '73, have you seen? A British tour caused such controversy. Christopher Monckton is a well-known climate sceptic, and he will be taking up the cudgels for that aspect of the debate. We have had a toss, and Richard Dennis will open the bowling. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Dr. Dennis.
Thank you, Steve, and thanks to the Press Club and to Lord Monkton, and of course to the audience for paying attention to what is a very, very important issue. Some would say the most important issue of our time. Now, I have to begin with a confession. It's true I worked for the Democrats and worked for the Greens, but I have not and am not and will not ever be a member of the scientific community. I am an economist, and I'm here today to talk about the way that economists and certainly politicians, as a general rule, go about making decisions under uncertainty. This is not an unusual situation for individuals to find themselves in, certainly not an unusual situation for politicians to find themselves in. Making questions when some people have doubts is, in fact, core business for citizens and for policymakers. So let me start with an analogy. Imagine that you went to the doctor, and I hope this doesn't happen, but imagine that you were diagnosed with a skin cancer, and the doctor, having diagnosed this skin cancer, suggested an intense and rapid treatment. The treatment unpleasant and potentially expensive, but the prognosis was good. Now that's bad news, and you might wish that it were other, so you might get a second opinion. You go to see another doctor, they confirm the diagnosis. You see a third doctor, you see a fourth doctor, they all confirm the diagnosis. But after after shopping around for long enough, spending more time while the cancer potentially spreads, you finally find a doctor who advises you that you don't have cancer, and even if you did have cancer, chemotherapy and radiotherapy are unlikely to work. There's plenty of evidence on the internet to suggest that herbal remedies would be far more effective. What would you do? What would you do? There are people out there telling you don't act. There are people out there saying the solutions won't work. But how would you, as a person, make a decision under such uncertainty? Now, I reckon most people would go with the science. And I think it's, call me old-fashioned, but I think it's just common sense. And I certainly suspect that our children and our family would encourage us to take the cautious route and listen to the science, not the optimistic route that perhaps the science is wrong and anyway maybe the treatments don't work. Now, anyone can ask a tricky question, but not all of us can make hard decisions. And we do have to make hard decisions when we make decisions about health, when we make decisions about climate change. Making hard decisions is something that adults have to do. But tricky questions can often get in the way of hard decisions. Imagine one of your friends discourages you from seeking treatment, says you can't trust these doctors, what do they know? They say the sun causes skin cancer. You go back and you ask them, you say, if I get sunburnt tomorrow, when will I get a skin cancer? And on what part of my body will it appear? And if they can't answer, then why would you trust them? Why would you pursue a potentially unpleasant and even costly course of action? Again, common sense suggests that most of us, while we might have those questions in our mind, will probably be willing and able to make a hard decision. Now, the overwhelming scientific consensus of climate change, of climate scientists on climate change, is that climate change is occurring, that the planet is warming, that it's human-induced, and that if we are to reduce our levels of pollution, that we have a good chance of turning things around. And when I say scientists, I mean NASA, I mean CSIRO, I mean the Australian and American Academies of Science. These bodies are quite clear in their statements. They are quite clear in their diagnosis, and they are quite clear in the prescription that they suggest that we take. But let's be clear, today you're watching a debate between two non-climate scientists. I'm not a climate scientist, Lord Monkton isn't a climate scientist, but we both obviously have an interest in the decisions that we as a society will make. The question is, how will we use the data that's provided to us by those esteemed bodies, or will we ignore that? That's a question for us as individuals, it's a question for us as a society, but we need to be clear about whose expertise that we are going to take. When we talk about experts, I'm not a climate scientist, most of you aren't climate scientists, we all have to make these decisions. It's not just the climate scientists that have made these decisions. In fact, in Australia, that well-known warmist John Howard accepted the science of climate change. He accepted that we needed to tackle climate change, and yes, he was reluctant to ratify the Kyoto Protocol, but in 2007, of course, he proposed the introduction of a price on pollution to tackle climate change. It's not just John Howard, of course. We've seen, in fact, nearly every leader of the Liberal Party has accepted the science of climate change, back to Andrew Peacock, Brendan Nelson, Malcolm Turnbull, and Tony Abbott, at least half of the time, seems to support the science of climate change. His support for climate science is about as reliable as his support for Peter Reith, but it is there at least some of the time. And it's not just Conservative politicians who are the warmists. We find in Australia that the big mining companies, the big oil companies, all accept the science of climate change. Their submissions to the Carbon Pollution Reduction Scheme inquiries overwhelmingly supported the science of climate change. And in Australia we have Ralph Hillman, the head of the Coal Association, along with a number of other leaders of the minerals community, all supporting both the science of climate change, and Marius Kloppers, the head of BHP, the biggest mining company in the world, not only supports the science of climate, but Marius Kloppers actually supports the introduction of a carbon tax to tackle the problem. Warmest. My point is that not only is the vast majority of climate scientists looked at the evidence and drawn these conclusions, our business leaders, our politicians from all sides of the political fence have actually taken that same advice and around the world are acting on it today. Not acting nearly fast enough, but acting nonetheless. Of course, it could be part of a giant conspiracy with BHP, Greenpeace, John Howard and my good self meeting regularly to discuss our proposals. Or it could just be that good people of goodwill, people who respect the evidence from a vast variety of backgrounds, have all accepted the same overwhelming conclusion and have all accepted that we should act. Now, even though the scientific community leaves very little room for doubt and very little room for uncertainty, even if there was uncertainty, most humans, most of the time, actually adopt the insurance principle when considering how to make decisions. That is, most of us insure our cars. Most of us spend $1,000 or more a year insuring our cars, and very few of us get to the end of the year and think, idiot, didn't crash my car. What am I doing? Wasting my money on a precaution that didn't even turn out to be necessary. As individuals, as a society, this is not how we make decisions about uncertainty. It's not responsible, indeed it's not even mature. And we usually find that people without insurance are usually people we describe as perhaps being adolescent or even immature. The sensible thing to do when the overwhelming body of evidence suggests that we should act and the costs of that action are small is to act. Now let me turn to the cost of action, because it's interesting that so many of the climate skeptics are also policy skeptics. That is, there's no reason to assume this would have to be the case, but so many people who don't trust the science don't trust the economics. And of course I'm referring here again to Tony Abbott, because Tony Abbott can't find a single economist in the country who will suggest that his scheme is in fact cheaper. So for the sceptics who tell us they're terrified of wasting billions of dollars tackling climate change, I would ask the simple question, why aren't you far more concerned with the cost of Tony Abbott's direct action scheme when every economist in the country, Tony Abbott can't find a single economist in the country to stand up and say his scheme is cheaper? Why is it that the climate sceptics are also economic sceptics? Are they all in on the conspiracy? Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. I'll now invite Lord Monckton to make his opening remarks. Lord Monckton, please.
My lords, that's me, ladies and gentlemen, the climate, like the cricket, is chaotic. Who would have believed that England would not only win back the Ashes, but would then hang on to them the next time round? Just thought I'd rub it in. Now, because the climate is chaotic, or even if it isn't, it acts as though it were, it is not predictable in the long term. And that, if you do science by consensus, and that was the central argument that Professor Dennis offered us today, that there is a consensus. If you do climate by consensus, then the consensus is expressed in the documents of IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. And they say that the climate is a coupled, non-linear, chaotic object, and that therefore the long-term prediction of future climate states is not possible. The Royal Society, in a complete rewrite of its original disastrously unscientific statement about the climate, now says we do not know how much the planet will warm as a result of our activities. And the idea that you decide any scientific question by mere consensus is opposed by the philosophers of science from Aristotle 2,400 years ago to Al-Haytham, the founder of the scientific method in 11th century Iraq, to Karl Popper in 1934 in the celebrated paper that formalized the scientific method as an iterative algorithm. In none of these people's opinion is science, or was it, or will it ever be, decided by consensus. As Einstein himself said when replying to a book by the Nazis who regarded his science as Jewish science and they wished to attack it, and they had 100 scientists against Einstein, he said, if there is something wrong with my theory, one paper will be enough to set the entire theory aside. You won't need 100 scientists. So merely counting heads, the argumentum ad populum, merely saying that various scientific societies are august, the argumentum ad verecundiam, the arguments from head count fallacy and reputation fallacy, respectively, are not proper scientific arguments. The sort of questions that you might have asked, and perhaps should ask in a free country, are these. You might have asked, I wonder why the usual suspects cry consensus when it is so clear in the history of science that consensus is not the way science is done. Why does official climate science still pretend the Middle Ages were not warmer than the present, when the fabricators of the 2001 UN report's purported abolition of the medieval warm period are now under criminal investigation for defrauding taxpayers by tampering with data and results? I wonder why the published version of the 1995 UN report, written by just one man, stated the exact opposite of the scientists' final draft, which had said 5 times that no human influence on global temperature was either discernible or immediately foreseeable. Or I wonder why the published version of the 2007 UN report deploys a flagrantly fraudulent statistical technique to pretend that the world is warming ever faster and that we are to blame. And why do we think that we're going to suddenly get 3.3 Celsius for a doubling of CO2 concentration this century, that's the IPCC's central estimate, or 5.1, which is your government's central estimate, when all the science done by measurement and observation rather than by models suggests just 1 Celsius degree. And then Professor Dennis raised the question of the insurance principle. Just in case there might be a risk of a large asteroid hitting us, we should spend 150% of global GDP from now forever to try to make sure we have a large cricket bat to knock them out of the way again. And in the London insurance market, we have a saying, and that is that if the cost of the premium exceeds the cost of the risk, don't insure. And that brings me to the carbon tax and the mineral resources rent tax. Now, both of these taxes are going to cost more than the cost of letting global warming happen in the first place. One question we should ask is, how much global warming will a 5% reduction in Australia's emissions, which represent in turn 1.2% of global emissions, actually achieve? Well, here's the numbers. 0.06% of world carbon emissions remitted over the next 10 years, and the amount of carbon dioxide that would have been in the atmosphere, according to the IPCC, would fall from, wait for it, 412 to 411.987 parts per million. And this would forestall, wait for it again, 0.00007 Celsius degrees of global warming. This is consensus mainstream calculation. And this is 1/14,000th of a Celsius degree. It is 1/700th of the threshold below which no modern method or instrument can detect any change in global temperature at all. And how much will it cost? Around 127 billion over the next 10 years. And if you were to apply the Gillard method all over the world, a method as cost ineffective as her proposals, then it would take $60,000 per head of the world population just in the next 10 years, or 60% of global GDP, just to forestall the 0.23 Celsius of global warming that the IPCC predicts will occur over the next 10 years. And it is clearly cheaper to do nothing about global warming and to adapt in a focused way to any consequences that are adverse that may occur from any warming that may occur, than to spend any money whatsoever now on it. And that, if you do science by consensus, as Professor Dennis does, is the overwhelming consensus in the peer-reviewed economic literature. And it's the peer-reviewed literature that you find the true science in. And reviews of that literature by Lomborg in 2007 and Richard Toll in 2009 make it abundantly clear that the majority, in fact, a near unanimity among economists, show that it is greatly more expensive to try to intervene and to try, Canute-like, to tamper with the climate than simply to sit back, enjoy the sunshine, and adapt in a focused way as and if and only when necessary. And therefore, the carbon tax is the wrong solution to a non-problem. It has no place in the future of Australia. And what I should have liked to hear from the press of Australia is those pressmen speaking up for the heroes of labour, the mine workers, who are menaced with the destruction of their jobs, the men who dig the darkness underground to bring us light. These great men, a dozen of whom joined me in the Hunter Valley on the platform when I spoke there last week and received a standing ovation from their terrified community. They want you, gentlemen of the press and ladies of the press, to speak for them. The coal workers, menaced by Prime Minister Brown with a destruction of their industry. And we too once had a Prime Minister called Brown, and we learned not to do that. So please, speak up for your working people. The tie that I wear today, and I proudly wear today, is the tie of the Democratic Labour Party, Senator John Madigan's party. I had the privilege of spending yesterday with this great man. And here is a man who speaks for Labour, who speaks for the people who are going to be disadvantaged by this tax. These are the people who need your help, not merely uncritically to accept consensus, but instead to ask the questions about the fraudulent science which is in each of the conclusions of the three major IPCC reports. Ask questions about why it is that global warming is happening at the moment and has been happening over the last 60 years at only 1/5 of the rate now predicted by your government. Ask the question how, in science, there could be any chance that the rate of just roughly 1 Celsius per century of warming that has been occurring can suddenly become roughly 5 Celsius per century, as it were, overnight. There is no physical basis in science for any such sudden lurch in what has proven to be an immensely stable climate. And the people of Australia are frightened. They are frightened of their government. They are frightened of you. The world is also frightened. Australia is now regarded as a sovereign risk. Please, I beg you, do not merely accept consensus, think and think again. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, we now turn to questions from our journalists in the audience. First question today is from Christian Kerr.
Christian Kerr from The Australian. A question to both our participants. Gentlemen, neither of you, as you have said, are scientists. Both of you have worked for very different politicians of very different philosophies. Today, aren't you just engaging in that old battle between laissez-faire and the central planners and the centrally controlled economy?
Lord Morgan. Well, thank you very much indeed for that fascinating question, Christian. And indeed, you could say that I am by inclination a non-interventionist. However, let it be very clear, if anyone convinces me that the science points to an alarming and dangerous rate of global warming, then I will change my tune and I will say that perhaps we should try to do something about it, provided that it is cheaper to do something about it than to take the consequences of not doing something about it. One has to ask two questions here. One, is it going to warm at anything like the predicted rate? That is the only scientific question that really needs to be answered. And I have studied and indeed lectured at faculty level in the determination of climate sensitivity. I have written papers in the reviewed literature on the subject. So I do have some knowledge of it as a reasonably competent mathematician who has profited enormously by the use of mathematics over the years. The eternity puzzle that I launched here in Australia 12 years ago became Puzzle of the Year in Australia. I'm glad you all enjoyed it so much. But the central point here is that that's the first question. How much warming are we going to get? It is now blindingly obvious, if you look at the data and the evidence, that the rate of warming simply isn't enough to be sufficient. And even if it were enough to be sufficient, it is blindingly obvious that it is far, far cheaper, and this is the important point, far cheaper, in fact something like 30 or 40 times cheaper, to do nothing about it now than to try to forestall it by the vastly expensive methods that your government currently proposes. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much. Look, it's a good question because, yeah, one of the strange things that Bob Brown, Natasha Stopes-Boyer and Margaret Thatcher have in common is, of course, that they all accept climate change. And it's an even better question because in Australia we have this sort of, well, historically unique situation where we have the Greens and the Labor Party pushing a market-based mechanism to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Again, one that the economists who may or may not be in on the conspiracy all agree is by far the cheapest way to address this problem, while we have the Conservative Party in Australia proposing the direct action scheme, which we've estimated in order to achieve the 700 million tonnes of abatement that the Liberal Party have said is their goal, which is, of course, the same goal as the Gillard government, it's just how we're going to get there, that we estimate there would be 150,000 grant applications required to achieve that 700 million tonnes of abatement. That is, under the direct action scheme, companies will fill out a form, say, here's how I'd like to reduce emissions, send it to Canberra, and a bureaucrat will read it and give it a score out of 10, and we'll come up with our favourite ones. We're going to literally require an army of bureaucrats to implement the direct action scheme. So in terms of political, I think climate change doesn't fit in the old left-right of politics. That's why that old lefty Arnold Schwarzenegger was so keen on it. It doesn't fit in the politics. With the economics and the science, both suggest that we should act, and that the best way to act is through a carbon price. But again, I just don't understand why the sceptics who say they're worried about the cost of action are so unconcerned about the very high cost of the Abbott proposal of direct action. Again, they both want the same target, they're both proposing 5%, it's just how do we get there?
Next question from Simon Gross. From Science Media. Last week in the north of this town we had an attack by some Greenpeace activists on a GM, an experimental plot of GM wheat. It reminded me of the symmetry between the public attitudes and acceptance or lack of when it comes to climate science and when it comes to GM plant science. In both cases we have very strong scientific consensus. And in both cases, we have a small minority of people who are seen to be sceptics, deniers, ratbags, iconoclasts. So I just want to ask both of you, why is it uncool to be a climate science denier, but it's cool to be a GM science denier? Richard?
Oh, look, very good question. Why isn't it cool to deny that that the sun causes skin cancer? Why isn't it cool to deny that immunisation protects our children from whooping cough? Why isn't it cool for any number of the conspiracies that you can find on the websites that suggest that all the science is wrong and some herbal remedy is right? Why don't we give that 50% of the editorial space in newspapers? Why don't we go and find the people that think that immunisation is causing disease, not protecting children, and give them 50% of the space on opinion pages? It's a fascinating question. Why have we taken scepticism about climate science and said that, sure, it might be a minority opinion, sure, the overwhelming majority of scientists might have reached settled conclusions based on data. We're talking about data that needs to be rejected here, not just models. Why is it that as a society we've placed climate scepticism on a pedestal, yet common sense tells us that yes, we understand why people might be concerned about GM crops, but we dismiss them as quirky. Yes, we understand why people might be concerned with immunisation, but without a strong scientific basis, as opposed to a really strongly held opinion, we just don't put them up on a press club address. I've never seen the immunisation sceptics here at the press club.
Well, hey, baby, I think that climate science scepticism is cool. And I think we ought to just mention a little bit about the history of Greenpeace, because it was founded, among others, by a friend of mine, the late Eric Ellington, who sadly died earlier this year. Now, Eric was a lovely man. He was totally non-political. He, like Patrick Moore and the other founders of Greenpeace, were true carers for the environment. They loved nature. They didn't want us to despoil it. They wanted to raise our consciousness of it. And they established Greenpeace to do just that. And with great sadness, this entirely non-political person said to me one day that he and many of his fellow founders of Greenpeace had to leave the organisation after a few years because, and this is how he put it, it had been taken over by Marxists who had not the slightest interest in the environment, but were willing to use it as a pretext for continuing the battle to bring down the West. So there is, and this was one of the founders of Greenpeace, this is what he said. He's not the only one. Patrick Moore has publicly said what Eric has said to me privately. There is a feeling that these environmental movements have been captured by political forces who are not necessarily friendly to the West and our way of life. So that's one side of it. But then, as far as GM science is concerned, genetic modification has been practiced for decades in crops and has led, among other things, for instance, to what used to be called miracle rice when I was a lad learning about this in school. And we were taught to admire this because of the greater yields that the rice could achieve, and therefore the many starving people in Africa would be saved from suffering. So I think that what we've got to get back to is true science, whether it's for GM crops or whether it's the climate. No more of this nonsense about consensus. Back to the equations.
If I may ask a follow-on question following that, I heard you this morning on radio, and from my recollection is that you articulated that view about Greenpeace. My recollection is that you also suggested that the Greens, both in Europe and in this country, had been effectively hijacked by Marxists and the like, who had an economic agenda. Is that a view that you hold about the Greens in this country, that they predominantly have an economic agenda, which is to, as I think you put it, to destroy the West?
Let me suggest how you can study this question scientifically. Read the Communist Manifesto, it is available online. Read the manifestos of the European Communist parties in the post-war period. Read the manifesto of your own Green Party, and, sir, go figure.
I'll ask Richard, as a former advisor to Bob Brown, to respond.
Well, I encourage you to do exactly that. I would go to the website and read both. But look, of course, the main point is that this conspiracy runs far deeper than the communist takeover of Greenpeace, because Malcolm Turnbull and John Howard and Marius Kloppers and Ralph Hillman, the head of the Coal Association, are in on it. Okay, we just really need an explanation here of what is it that's driving the head of BHP to accept this, and why is Woodside using climate science to predict how much stronger its gas rigs will need to be to resist the climate change that their gas is going to cause.
Next question, Andrew Tillett.
Andrew Tillett, the West Australian. Question for both of you, just about the tone of the debate about climate change, not the one here, but in the wider community, where it seems to degenerate into a lot of name-calling and mudslinging on both sides. And, I mean, we had, like Lord Monckton's beginning of the trip, you were sort of overshadowed with the comments about Professor Garneau, which you subsequently apologised for, but that prompted someone like Malcolm Turnbull to call you a rather sick vaudeville character. We have...
That's better than he manages.
Are we getting? Is there going to be any hope of getting a more civilised tone to this debate, or has it become too polarised?
I'll ask Richard to respond civilly.
I'll start now. Look, thanks for the question, and I think it's deeply concerning. I mean, I hope that Lord Monckton is right about climate change. I hope that he is right, but I fear that he's not, and that fear is based on science, and that fear is based on evidence. And I think that as a society, and as a democratic society, we have to respect each other's points of view. And I'm deeply concerned that climate scientists in Australia have received death threats. I'm deeply concerned that someone wielded a noose in front of a climate scientist in Melbourne last week. I'm deeply concerned that someone spoke at a rally in Queensland recently and said, do you understand why we feel like taking arms up against this government? Because in a democracy, you should make the case, you should debate the case for why you believe you are right, and you should accept the consequences in a democracy of when others don't agree with you. So I'm terrified that in Australia at the moment we are creating a temperature in which, while ostensibly we're having a debate about climate science, there are people whipping up fundamental problems for our democracy, and that is the respect to agree with other people even when you are in the minority. And if a majority agrees to act in a democracy, we go along with it. We don't brandish nooses at people.
First of all, ladies and gentlemen of the press, I hope that you would regard us as conducting a civilised debate here, and I should certainly like at this point to pay tribute to my opponent in this debate, who has conducted himself in an entirely civilised fashion, and I'm going to try to do the same. So can we give him a round of applause? Now, I am concerned that 3 weeks before I arrived in Australia, one of your journalists said that climate sceptics should be branded with tattoos. I'm concerned that 2 weeks before I came to Australia, one of your journalists on a leading national newspaper, in that national newspaper, said that climate sceptics should be gassed. Now, I wonder what kind of a regime it was that used to do that to its opponents. And what I'm particularly concerned about, ladies and gentlemen of the press, is that you have quite rightly called me out for a single, inadvertent, crass remark for which I have completely and abjectly and humbly and unreservedly apologised, and I renew that apology now, and yet you have not asked your own number who have done similar things, in fact worse things, to apologise. And Andrew, you say you work for the West Australian. Was this the paper whose headline a couple of weeks ago was "Ban the Lord," with a large picture of me? Was that a civilised tone? I'm not sure that it was. So let us all agree that in future this debate should be conducted at a more scientific level. It is not enough to wave our arms and say the science is clear when the climate is a chaotic object and therefore the science can never be clear. It's not good enough to say the science is clear because there's a consensus, because consensus is not the way science is done. Science is done by hard work, hard research, checking, checking and checking again. Back to those equations again. Sam Carver.
Hi, Sam Carver from Australian Associated Press. So, Lord Moulton, you say that you should reject the consensus, but isn't a scientific consensus a consensus of evidence rather than a consensus of opinion? And you say that you're willing to be convinced. What would it take for you to be convinced that climate change was happening?
Right. First of all, climate change has been happening for the last 4,567 million years, since that Tuesday on which the world first formed and the first wisps of the atmosphere. So, of course, I do not deny that climate change is happening, nor do I deny that if we add CO2 to the atmosphere, some warming is likely to result. But as a specialist in the field of the determination of climate sensitivity, and I lecture on this, as I said, at faculty level, I can assure you that there is no agreement among those scientists who have studied that question on how much warming there is going to be, and I have already adduced evidence from the Royal Society who have said exactly that in terms in their restatement of the science on climate just this year. So science, if you're saying that a scientific consensus is somehow not a consensus of opinion, but a consensus of evidence, you have to say, and you did not say, what evidence you mean. On the evidence that I have seen, let us just take one example of it. If we go back to 1750, how much warming has there been since then? Well, using the Central England temperature record as a proxy for global temperatures, it's not bad for that purpose, it's at the right latitude. We've had 0.9 Celsius of warming in response to an addition of greenhouse gases to the atmosphere by us. which is almost equivalent to a doubling of CO2 concentration. That's going to give you around 1 Celsius of warming per doubling of CO2 concentration. Over the last 60 years, we again see 1 Celsius of warming per century happening. All the evidence points to 1 Celsius of warming for a doubling of CO2 and not the 3.3 predicted by the IPCC as its central estimate on current emissions, or the 5.1 Celsius over the next 90 years predicted by your government. These are exaggerations which are not the consensus in the literature, and you should understand that the literature is much wider and reflects far more scientific opinions than many of you have been willing to allow or discover. Get on with your work.
It's interesting that skeptics so often take the best case scenario they can find in the science and the worst case scenario they can find in the economics and convince themselves that having chosen two extreme positions, it would be crazy to act. There is a range of evidence, and I'll put all this up on our website for people who are interested, but the Joint Academy's statement, the Bureau of Meteorology, the CSIRO, the National Academy of Sciences have all formed an entirely different view than Lord Monckton. So I just think we have to be very careful about distinguishing consensus and expertise and opinion from the fact that the groups that we trust, hopefully that we trust to advise us on these, have uniformly agreed on the conclusion, even if there is some doubt remaining about the decimal places. So again, choosing the best case science you can find, comparing it to the worst case economics you can find, is a very narrow and dangerous way to run a policy debate.
Next question from Jennifer Bennett.
Hello, Jennifer Bennett from Campus Review. Question for Lord Monckton. You're often critical of climate change scientists because they don't like to go head-to-head with you in a public debate. Australian scientists have told us that a debate forum doesn't allow the time and format necessary for communicating complex information. If you're so certain of the facts, why not debate the scientists on their own terms? Why won't you submit the research you say you've undertaken to a quality peer-reviewed journal to be assessed?
I wonder why it is that Professor Tim Flannery, who knows no more about climate science than I do, is never asked that question. Why Al Gore is never asked that question. Why Professor Stephan is never asked that question. And may I perhaps refer the Honourable Lady to Physics and Society for July 2008, where you will find an article entitled Climate Sensitivity Reconsidered. The author is Christopher Walter Monckton of Brenchley, and the article was indeed reviewed by Professor Alvin Saperstein, the Professor of Physics at Wayne State University, and also the review editor of the journal concerned at the time. The American Physical Society, yes, that's right. Indeed it does. So why don't you check with Professor Saperstein to find out whether he in fact reviewed it? Have you done that? No, I didn't think you had. Once again, please will you do your homework? What I'm saying is, if you take a preconceived position on this question, and therefore you don't check both sides of what you are told, rather than only checking my side because you're on the other side, then you will not get a balanced view on this question. The fact is that I am under no more obligation to publish in the peer-reviewed literature on this than anyone else. I have published in the reviewed literature. They try to say it wasn't peer review now, but they were perfectly happy to say it was peer review at the time. They were lent upon. This happens. You know, we too are sometimes victims of the other side going too far and putting too much pressure on. The two editors of that journal were sacked for publishing that paper. They shouldn't have been. It was a perfectly acceptable paper. There's not a lot wrong with it scientifically. And so read that if you want to see what my opinion is on climate sensitivity. It contains 30 relatively clear equations, each one of which the professor required me to justify in order that they could be included in the paper. It was a very thorough scientific review. Thank you.
Just to follow up.
Jennifer, I'm going to give Richard Wright a reply. Thank you.
You've had your I'm going to give Richard Rudd a reply. Thank you very much.
Well, look, I agree with Lord Monckton. I urge you to do your homework. I urge you to, we'll put links up on this to our website tomorrow, but, you know, it doesn't take long on the internet to find comprehensive, systematic, and, as you said, timely. It takes a bit of time to work through you know, some of the misnomers in this the science. The problem is that it only takes a minute to start a bushfire and can take a week to put one out. You know, that's why the scientists don't like these debates, because asking tricky questions is quicker than answering them. And the point about Tim Flannery and Al Gore, well, of course, neither of them claim to be climate scientists, but what they're doing is they're standing on the shoulders of those thousands of climate scientists who have done the work, who have done the equations, who have collected the data, who have questioned each other and settled on a conclusion. So I urge you to do exactly the homework that Lord Monckton is urging you to do, because these questions have been asked many times. I've heard them asked many times, but the answers don't seem to have any impact on the questioners.
Next question, Jacqueline Maley.
Jacqueline Maley from the Sydney Morning Herald. Lord Monckton, you said that the carbon tax is the wrong solution to a non-problem. I'm just interested in your views on the Coalition's direct action policy. It's also a proposed solution to what you say is a non-problem. Should the Coalition ditch it?
Yes, the Coalition should, in my opinion, ditch it, because there is no need to take any action about carbon dioxide at all. That is why Canada has announced that she is not going to participate in a Kyoto 2. Japan has announced the same. Even America has announced the same. China has announced that if she has a carbon tax at all, it will be at just $1.50 per tonne. Why, therefore, set your own working people at a huge disadvantage by imposing upon them a carbon tax at a rate which is unmatched anywhere else in the world, and which most other countries are no longer going to pursue? It is not good enough merely to recite that there is a consensus of thousands of climate scientists. The number of climate scientists who, by measurement, observation and experiment, and by the application of established theory to the results, have even attempted to determine climate sensitivity, which is how much warming we are going to get, numbers not in the thousands, but in the dozens. And most of those have concluded that the matter is indeed highly uncertain, and some of them, such as Professor Richard Lindzen and his colleague Young-Sang Choi, in a paper published earlier this year, have determined that the amount of outgoing radiation reaching space is far greater than that which would allow high climate sensitivity, and they estimate, once again, that there would be less than 1 Celsius degree of warming for a doubling of CO2 concentration. We might also cite Spencer and Braswell, 2010, who have said similar things, having at last measured the cloud feedback and found it to attenuate global warming by as much as the IPCC had thought it increased it. And I could go on reciting paper after paper after paper, done by measurement and observation, which clearly establishes the strong likelihood that climate sensitivity is low. And therefore it is not acceptable to say the science is settled. You must read the literature and read it widely and understand that there is no consensus on this, there can be no consensus on this, and the way things are turning out at the moment, the likelihood of high climate sensitivity of any problem whatsoever with the climate is very small indeed.
Richard, sorry.
And of course, that the literature that's being referred to there is a trivial percentage of the overwhelming evidence. Again, the Joint Academies, the Bureau of Meteorology, NASA. I just refer you back. If you really believe that NASA can't be trusted, that their data can't be trusted, then perhaps you shouldn't use your GPS, and you might want to ask some hard questions about the moon landing. But again, your actual question was where is the skeptics' concern with direct action? If you are genuinely worried about the cost of tackling climate change, and every economist is of the view, or again, Tony Abbott can't find a single economist to agree with him that his scheme is cheaper. If you believe climate change is bunkum, which I don't think is based on the evidence, but if you believe that, you should be more concerned that we would waste billions more dollars tackling it through an inexpensive scheme. Why are climate sceptics economic sceptics as well?
Thank you. Next question from Alex Hart.
Alex Hart from the 7 Network, sorry for interrupting there. I'm not sure if it's the right title to use, but my question is to Lord Monckton. I'm asking about a letter that was written to you by David Beamish from the UK Clerk of the Parliament over there, saying that he'd like you to stop claiming that you are a member of the House of Lords. What's your response to this? Will you stop using that title? Why or why not? And does it harm your credibility?
Sir, would you be kind enough to read out the words in this box on the passport page?
The holder is the Right Honourable Christopher Walter Viscount Monckton of Brenchley.
Thank you very much. The House of Lords says I'm not a member of it. My passport says I am. Get used to it. What I will do, therefore, since I had, as a condition of taking part in this debate, insisted that ad hominem questions of that futile and drivelling kind should not be asked, I'm going to take a free kick and I'm going to get back to the climate, which is what we are here to debate, not the way the House of Lords works. The IPCC's estimates of the amount of warming from a doubling of CO2 concentration, 2 to 4.5 Celsius, with a central estimate 3.26 Celsius, suggest a feedback loop gain in the climate system of between 0.42 and 0.74, with a central estimate 0.64. However, that is a near impossibility, physically speaking, because in any object on which feedbacks operate, if the feedback loop gain is greater than somewhere in a range of 0.01 to 0.1, the object becomes terminally unstable, and under conditions which might quite easily occur, the loop gain would reach 1 and the system would blow itself apart. Since this hasn't happened, we have a very good evidence from process engineering in this case that once again the likely rate of warming for a doubling of CO2 is 1 Celsius degree. Thank you.
Richard?
Well, it's my turn to take a free kick. The Australian government is proposing, there's bipartisan consensus, that we spend around $50 billion, 50 billion with a B, to buy 12 new submarines to replace the 6 we haven't used yet. And no one is certain who we need them to protect us from. And no one is certain what day we will need them, and no one is certain where we should park them on that day, and no one is certain, if you followed the Navy, whether we'll have enough crew to staff them. But when it comes to making decisions about national defence, when it comes to making decisions about our health, whenever the consequences are high, whenever the consequences are catastrophic, what sensible people do is take the conservative path. The overwhelming evidence is that we face catastrophic risks from climate change. The overwhelming evidence is from the economists that the costs of tackling this will actually be very small, especially in economies as rich as our own. So we can bet the house that Lord Monckton is right, or we could insure the house in case he's wrong.
And a final question today from Mark Kenny.
Mark Kenny from The Advertiser. Lord Monckton, I'll take it from your response to Mr Hart's question that you reject that letter from the House of Lords.
I've told them it's impertinent and they should put my reply on their website. They have not so far found the courage to answer.
All right. Look, can I ask you a question which I guess is a first principles question that would have been maybe better asked earlier, but would you like to see companies and individuals put less pollution skyward than is the case now and than will be the case with a growing population, or are you unconcerned about it?
Right, let us distinguish between pollution which usually means particulate pollution such as soot, or the emission of carbon dioxide, which on any view is not a pollutant. It is plant and tree food. If we were able to manage a doubling of CO2 concentration this century, which is what I expect to happen regardless of the carbon tax, then what we would find is that at the end of the century, the yield of certain staple crops would rise by up to 40%, and they would be able to survive on less water as well. The greening of the planet in the 30 years since satellites have been watching, as a result of what is known as CO2 fertilization, is absolutely wonderful. It's actually gone up by 6%. The net primary productivity of plants has risen by 6%. So CO2, if you really are a green and you really want to green the planet, is the way to go. Richard, a quick response to that?
Pollution is a harmful byproduct from a process, and unless we've underestimated the generosity of coal-fired power stations for giving us all this free fertiliser for the last 100 years, carbon dioxide is literally a pollutant. It is an unintended and, in a climate-constrained environment, harmful byproduct, and economists have said for 200 years, when you want to solve a pollution problem, the most efficient way to do it is to introduce a price.
Imagine that we live in an age of reason, and the global warming alarm is dressed up as science, but it's not science, it's propaganda.
There's no direct evidence which links 20th century global warming to anthropogenic greenhouse gases.
We're just being told lies. That's what it comes down to.
We can't say that CO2 will drive climate. It certainly never did in the past.
If the CO2 increases in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, then the temperature will go up. But the ice core record shows exactly the opposite. So the fundamental assumption of the whole theory of climate change due to humans is shown to be wrong.
Man-made global warming is no longer just a theory about climate. It is one of the defining moral and political causes of our age. Campaigners say the time for debate is over. Any criticism, no matter how scientifically rigorous, is illegitimate. Even worse, dangerous. But in this film, it will be shown that there is nothing unusual about the current temperature, that the Earth's climate is always changing, and that the scientific evidence does not support the notion that climate is driven by carbon dioxide, man-made or otherwise. Everywhere you are told that man-made climate change is proved beyond doubt, but you are being told lies.
When people say, we don't believe in global warming, I say, no, I believe in global warming. I don't believe that human CO2 is causing that warming.
A few years ago, if you would ask me, I would tell you it's CO2. Why? Because just like everyone else in the public, I listened to what the media had to say.
Each day, news reports about man-made global warming grow more fantastically apocalyptic. And yet a number of senior climate scientists now say the theory simply doesn't make sense.
There were periods, for example, in Earth's history when we had 3 times as much CO2 as we have today, or periods when we had 10 times as much CO2 as we have today. And if CO2 has a large effect on climate, then you should see it in the temperature reconstruction.
If we look at climate through the geological time frame, we would never suspect CO2 as a major climate driver.
None of the major climate changes in the last 1,000 years
can be explained by CO2.
We can't say that CO2 will drive climate. It certainly never did in the past.
I've often heard it said that there is a consensus of thousands of scientists on the global warming issue and that humans are causing a catastrophic change to the climate system. Well, I am one scientist, and there are many that simply think that is not true.
Man-made global warming is no ordinary scientific theory. It is supported by a powerful political body, the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC.
The IPCC, like any UN body, is political. The final conclusions are politically driven.
This claim that the IPCC is the world's top 1,500 or 2,500 scientists, you look at the bibliographies of the people and it's simply not true. There are quite a number of non-scientists.
And to build the number up to 2,500, they have to start taking reviewers and government people and so on, anyone who ever came close to them. And none of them are asked to agree. Many of them disagree.
Those people who are specialists but don't agree with the polemic and resign, and there have been a number that I know of, they are simply put on the author list and become part of this 2,500 of the world's top scientists.
This is a story of how a theory about climate turned into a political ideology.
See, I don't even like to call it the environmental movement anymore, because really it is a political activist movement, and they have become hugely influential at a global level.
It is a story of the distortion of a whole area of science.
Climate scientists need there to be a problem in order to get funding.
We have a vested interest in creating panic, because then money will flow to climate science.
There's one thing you shouldn't say, and that is, this might not be a problem.
It is the story of how a political campaign turned into a bureaucratic bandwagon.
Fact of the matter is that tens of thousands of jobs depend upon global warming right now. It's a big business.
It's become a great industry in itself. And if the whole global warming farrago collapsed, there'd be an awful lot of people out of jobs and looking for work.
This is a story of censorship and intimidation.
I have seen and heard their spitting fury at anybody who might disagree with them, which is not the scientific way. Climate science is an incredibly angry science, and I take that anger as actually a sign of weakness.
In 2005, a House of Lords inquiry was set up to examine the scientific evidence of man-made global warming. A leading figure in that inquiry was Lord Lawson of Blaby, who, as Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1980s, was the first politician to commit government money to global warming research.
We had a very, very thorough inquiry, took evidence from a whole lot of people expert in this area and produced a report. What surprised me was to discover how weak and uncertain the science was. In fact, there are more and more thoughtful people, some of them a little bit frightened to come out in the open, but who quietly, privately, and some of them publicly, are saying, hang on, wait a minute, this simply doesn't add up.
We are told that we should be worried because the Earth's climate is changing. But the Earth's climate is always changing. In Earth's long history, there have been countless periods when it was much warmer and much cooler than it is today. The climate has always changed, and changed without any help from us humans. We can trace the present warming trend back at least 200 years, to the end of a very cold period in Earth's history. This cold spell is known to climatologists as the Little Ice Age.
In the 14th century, Europe plunged into the Little Ice Age. And where we would look for evidence of this are the old illustrations and prints of Old Father Thames, because during the hardest and toughest winters of that Little Ice Age, the Thames would freeze over. And there were wonderful ice fairs held on the Thames, skating, and people actually selling things on the ice.
If we look back further in time, before the Little Ice Age, we find a balmy golden era when temperatures were higher than they are today, a time known to climatologists as the medieval warm period.
It's important that people know that climate enabled a quite different lifestyle in the medieval period. We have this view today that warming is going to have apocalyptic outcomes. In fact, wherever you describe this warm period, it appears to be associated with riches.
In Europe, this was the great age of the cathedral builders, a time when, according to Chaucer, vineyards flourished even in the north of England.
All over the city of London, there are little memories of the vineyards that grew in the medieval warm period. So this was a wonderfully rich time. And this little church, in a sense, symbolizes it, because it comes from a period of great wealth.
Going back in time further still, before the medieval warm period, we find more warm spells, including a very prolonged period during the Bronze and Stone Ages known to geologists as the Holocene maximum, when temperatures were significantly higher than they are now for more than 3 millennia.
If we go back 8,000 years in the Holocene period, our current interglacial, it was much warmer than it is today. Now the polar bears obviously survived that period. They're with us today. They are very adaptable, and these warm periods in the past, what we call hypsithermals, pose no problem for them.
Climate variation in the past is clearly natural. So why do we think it's any different today? In the current alarm about global warming, the culprit is industrial society. Thanks to modern industry, luxuries once enjoyed exclusively by the rich are now available in abundance to ordinary people. Novel technologies have made life easier and richer. Modern transport and communications have made the world seem less foreign and distant. Industrial progress has changed our lives. But has it also changed the climate? According to the theory of man-made global warming, industrial growth should cause the temperature to rise. But does it?
Anyone who goes around and says that carbon dioxide is responsible for most of the warming of the 20th century hasn't looked at the basic numbers.
In the early decades of the 20th century, much of the world was still pre-industrial. Very few people had cars or even electricity. Industry was still fairly primitive, restricted to only a few countries and crippled by economic depression. But after the Second World War, things changed. Consumer goods like refrigerators and washing machines and TVs and cars began to be mass-produced for an international market. Historians call this global explosion of industrial activity the post-war economic boom. So how does this compare with the temperature record? This is the record of world temperature during the 20th century used by the IPCC. In the past 150 years, the temperature has risen just over ½ degree Celsius. But the strange thing is, most of that rise occurred in the early decades of the 20th century, between 1905 and 1940, when industrial production was still relatively small. After 1940, as industry expanded, for some reason the world cooled. This cooling is even more pronounced in other temperature reconstructions. This graph shows temperature change in the Arctic during the 20th century. Again, most of the rise occurs before 1940. And again, during the post-war economic boom, the temperature falls and continues falling for 35 years.
CO2 began to increase exponentially in about 1940, but the temperature actually began to decrease 1940, continued till about 1975. So this is the opposite relation. When the CO2 is increasing rapidly, but yet the temperature is decreasing, then we cannot say that CO2 and the temperature go together.
Temperature went up significantly up to 1940, when human production of CO2 was relatively low. And then in the post-war years, when industry and the whole economies of the world really got going, and human production of CO2 just soared, the global temperature was going down. In other words, the facts didn't fit the theory.
Just at a time when, after the Second World War, industry was booming, carbon dioxide was increasing, and yet the Earth was getting cooler and starting off scares of a coming ice age, it made absolutely no sense. It still doesn't make sense.
Why do we suppose that carbon dioxide is responsible for our changing climate? CO2 forms only a very small part of the Earth's atmosphere. In fact, we measure changes in the level of atmospheric CO2 in tens of parts per million.
If you take CO2 as a percentage of all the gases in the atmosphere, the oxygen, the nitrogen, and argon, and so on, it's 0.054%. It's an incredibly small portion. And then, of course, you've got to take that portion that supposedly humans are adding, which is the focus of all the concern, and it gets even smaller.
The greenhouse effect is only one part of the Earth's climate system, and CO2 is a relatively minor greenhouse gas.
The atmosphere is made up of a multitude of gases. A small percentage of them we call greenhouse gases, and of that very small percentage of greenhouse gases, 95% of it is water vapor. It's the most important greenhouse gas.
Water vapor is a greenhouse gas, by far the most important greenhouse gas.
Not only is CO2 a secondary greenhouse gas, it is far from clear that greenhouse gas of any sort is responsible for climate change. To find out, we must look up into the sky, or a part of the sky called the troposphere.
If it's greenhouse warming, you get more warming in the middle of the troposphere, the first 10, 12 kilometers of the atmosphere, than you do at the surface. There are good theoretical reasons for that, having to do with how the greenhouse works.
The greenhouse effect works like this. The sun sends its heat down to Earth. If it weren't for greenhouse gases, this solar radiation would bounce back into space, leaving the planet cold and uninhabitable. Greenhouse gas traps the escaping heat in the Earth's troposphere, a few miles above the surface. And it's here, according to the climate models, that the rate of warming should be highest if it's greenhouse gas that's causing it.
All the models, every one of them, calculates that the warming should be faster as you go up from the surface into the atmosphere. And in fact, the maximum warming over the equator should take place at an altitude of about 10 kilometers.
A scientist largely responsible for measuring the temperature in the Earth's atmosphere is Professor John Christie. In 1991, Professor Christie was awarded NASA's Medal for Exceptional Scientific Achievement, and in 1996 received a special award from the American Meteorological Society for fundamentally advancing our ability to monitor climate. He was also a lead author on the UN's Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC. There are two ways used by scientists like Professor Christie to take the temperature in the Earth's atmosphere: satellites and weather balloons.
What we found consistently is that in a great part of the planet, that the bulk of the atmosphere is not warming as much as we see at the surface in this region. And that's a real head-scratcher for us, because the theory is pretty straightforward. And the theory says that if the surface warms, the upper atmosphere should warm rapidly. The rise in temperature of that part of the atmosphere is not very dramatic at all, and really does not match the theory that climate models are expressing at this point.
One of the problems that is plaguing the models is that they predict that as you go up through the atmosphere, except in the polar regions, that the rate of warming increases. And it's quite clear from two data sets, not just satellite data, which everybody talks about, but from weather balloon data, that you don't see that effect. In fact, it looks like the surface temperatures are warming slightly more than the upper air temperatures. Oh, that's a big difference.
That data gives you a handle on the fact that what you're seeing is warming that probably is not due to greenhouse gases.
That is, the observations do not show an increase with altitude. In fact, most observations show a slight decrease in the rate of warming with altitude. So in a sense, you can say that the hypothesis of man-made global warming is falsified by the evidence.
The recent warming of the Earth happened in the wrong place and at the wrong time. If CO2 were driving climate change, then the temperature should have gone up during the post-war economic boom. And the rate of warming should be higher in the troposphere than at the surface. But the very opposite happened. So is there any evidence from Earth's long climate history that carbon dioxide has ever driven temperature change? One way of looking back in time is to drill down deep into the ice. And here, scientists have indeed found a connection between CO2 and the Earth's changing temperature. The ice cores are frequently cited in support of the theory of man-made global warming. But there is something in the ice core data that is very rarely mentioned. Professor Ian Clarke is a leading Arctic paleoclimatologist who looks back into the Earth's temperature record hundreds of thousands of years.
When we look at climate on long scales, we're looking for geological material that actually records climate. If we're to take an ice sample, for example, we use isotopes to reconstruct temperature, but the atmosphere that's imprisoned in that ice we liberate, and then we look at the CO2 content.
Professor Clarke and others have indeed discovered a link between carbon dioxide and temperature. But the link is the wrong way round.
So here we're looking at the ice core record from Vostok, and in the red we see temperature going up from early time to later time at a very key interval when we came out of a glaciation. And we see the temperature going up, and then we see the CO2 coming up. CO2 lags behind that increase. It's got an 800-year lag, so temperature is leading CO2 by 800 years.
There have now been several major ice core surveys. Every one of them shows the same thing. The temperature rises or falls, and then after a few hundred years, carbon dioxide follows.
So obviously, carbon dioxide is not the cause of that warming. In fact, we can say that the warming produced the increase in carbon dioxide.
CO2 clearly cannot be causing temperature changes. It's a product of temperature. It's following temperature changes.
The ice core record goes to the very heart of the problem we have here. They said, if the CO2 increases in the atmosphere as a greenhouse gas, then the temperature will go up. But the ice core record shows exactly the opposite. So the fundamental assumption, the most fundamental assumption of the whole theory of climate change due to humans is shown to be wrong.
But how can it be that higher temperatures lead to more CO2 in the atmosphere? The answer lies deep in the oceans. The oceans contain vast amounts of carbon dioxide, and each year they emit large quantities into the atmosphere, far more than humans do. But oceans also absorb large amounts of CO2 back out of the atmosphere. And how much they emit and how much they absorb depends on the temperature.
As every school child knows from their geography textbook, the oceans and the atmosphere exchange carbon dioxide. When the oceans warm up, they release carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. When they cool down again, they take in the carbon dioxide and they store it.
But why is there a time lag of hundreds of years between a change in temperature and a change in the amount of carbon dioxide going into or out of the sea? The reason is that the oceans are so big and so deep, it takes literally centuries for them to heat up and cool down.
The oceans are vast, and they occupy most of the surface of the Earth. And it's because of this vastness that they take such a long time to warm up or to cool down, often hundreds of years.
The common belief that carbon dioxide is driving climate change is at odds with much of the available scientific data. data from weather balloons and satellites, data from the ice cores, and from the historical temperature records. But if CO2 isn't driving climate, what is?
Isn't it bizarre to think that it's humans, you know, when we're filling up our car, turning on our lights, that we're the ones controlling climate? Just look in the sky. Look at that massive thing, the sun. Even humans at our present 6.5 billion are minute relative to that.
In the late 1980s, solar physicist Piers Corbyn decided to try a radically new way of forecasting the weather. Despite the huge resources of the official Met Office, Corbyn's new technique consistently produced more accurate results. He was hailed in the press as a super weatherman. The secret of his success was the sun.
The origin of our solar weather technique of long-range forecasting came originally from study of sunspots and a desire to predict those. And then I realised it was actually much more interesting to use the sun to predict the weather.
Sunspots, we now know, are intense magnetic fields which appear at times of higher solar activity. But for many hundreds of years, long before this was properly understood, astronomers around the world used to count the number of sunspots in the belief that more spots heralded warmer weather. In 1893, the British astronomer Edward Maunder observed that during the Little Ice Age there were barely any spots visible on the sun, a period of solar inactivity which became known as the Maunder minimum. But how reliable are sunspots as an indicator of the weather?
Take care. Bye. I decided to test it by gambling on the weather through William Hill against what the Met Office said was a normal expectation. And I won money month after month after month after month. Last winter the Met Office said it could be or would be an exceptionally cold winter. We said, no, that is nonsense, it's going to be very close to normal. And we specifically said when it would be cold, i.e. after Christmas and February. We were right, they were wrong.
In 1991, senior scientists at the Danish Meteorological Institute decided to compile a record of sunspots in the 20th century and compare it with the temperature record. What they found was an incredibly close correlation between what the sun was doing and changes in temperature on Earth. Solar activity, they found, rose sharply to around 1940, fell back until the 1970s, and then started to rise again.
When we saw this correlation between the temperature and solar activity or sunspot cycle lengths, then people said to us, okay, it can be just a coincidence. So how can we prove that it's not just a coincidence? Well, one obvious thing is to have a longer time series or different time series. Then we went back in time.
So Professor Friis Christiansen and his colleagues gathered together astronomical records for the past 400 years in order to compare sunspot activity against temperature variation. Once again, they found that variations in solar activity were intimately linked to temperature change on Earth. It was the sun, it seemed, not carbon dioxide or anything else, that was driving changes in the climate. The sun affects the Earth directly when it sends down heat. But scientists have now established that the sun also affects us indirectly by regulating the formation of clouds. In fact, the sun affects the Earth in so many ways that perhaps it shouldn't surprise us that variations in solar activity correspond so closely with the Earth's changing climate.
If you had X-ray eyes, what appears as a nice, friendly yellow ball would appear like a raging tiger. The sun is an incredibly violent beast, and it's throwing out great puffs of gas, an endless solar wind that's forever rushing past the Earth. We're, in a certain sense, inside the atmosphere of the sun. The intensity of its magnetic field more than doubled during the 20th century.
In 2005, astrophysicists from Harvard University published the following graph in the official journal of the American Geophysical Union. The blue line represents temperature change in the Arctic over the past 100 years. And here is the rise in carbon dioxide over the same period. The two are not obviously connected. But now look again at the temperature record and at this red line, which depicts variations in solar activity over the past century as recorded independently by scientists from NASA and America's National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration.
Solar activity over the last 100 years, over the last several hundred years, correlates very nicely on a decadal basis with sea ice and Arctic temperatures.
For many scientists, the conclusion is inescapable.
The sun is driving climate change. CO2 is irrelevant.
But why, if this is so, are we bombarded day after day with news items about man-made global warming? Why do so many people in the media and elsewhere regard it as an undisputed fact? To understand the power of global warming theory, we must tell the story of how it came about. Doom-laden predictions about the climate are not new. In 1974, the BBC warned us that severe storms and droughts might be signs of an impending catastrophe. And what was to be the cause of this climate disaster? The man behind the series was former New Scientist editor Nigel Calder.
In the weather machine, we reported the mainstream opinion of the time, which was global cooling and the threat of a new ice age.
Nature's ice dwarfs us and outstrips...
After decades of falling temperatures, experts warned that a cooler world would have catastrophic consequences.
There's the ever-present threat of a big freeze. Will a new ice age claim our lands and bury our northern cities?
But amid the doom and gloom, there was one voice of hope. A Swedish scientist called Bert Bolin tentatively suggested that man-made carbon dioxide might help to warm the world, although he wasn't sure.
And there is a lot of oil, and there are vast amounts of coal left. We seem to be burning it with an ever-increasing rate. And if we go on doing this, in about 50 years' time, the climate may be a few degrees warmer than today. We just don't know.
We were also the first to put Bert Bolin of Sweden on international television talking about the dangers of carbon dioxide.
For an increasing amount of carbon dioxide in the air.
And I remember being bitterly criticized by top experts for indulging him in his fantasy.
At the height of the cooling scare in the 70s, Bert Bolin's eccentric theory of man-made global warming seemed absurd. Two things happened to change that. First, temperatures started to rise, and second, in Britain, the coal miners went on strike. To Prime Minister Margaret Thatcher, energy was a political problem. In the early 70s, the oil crisis had plunged the world into recession. In Britain, a devastating miners' strike had also caused electricity blackouts and led to the downfall of a Conservative government. Mrs. Thatcher was determined the same would not happen to her.
What we have seen in this country is the emergence of an organized revolutionary minority whose real aim is the destruction of democratic parliamentary government.
The politicization of the subject started with Margaret Thatcher.
She was very concerned always, I remember when I was Secretary of State for Energy, to promote nuclear power. Long before the issue of climate change came up, because she was concerned about energy security, and she didn't trust the Middle East, and she didn't trust the National Union of Mine Workers. So she didn't trust oil, and she didn't trust coal. So therefore she felt we really had to push ahead with nuclear power. And then when the climate change, global warming thing came up, she felt, well, this is great. This is another argument, because it doesn't have any carbon dioxide emissions. This is another argument why you should go for nuclear. And that is what she was really largely saying. It's been misrepresented since then.
And so she said to the scientists, she went to the Royal Society and she said, there's money on the table for you to prove this stuff. So, of course, they went away and did that.
Inevitably, the moment politicians put their weight behind something and attach their name to it in some ways, of course, money will flow. That's the way it goes. And inevitably, research, development, institutions started to bubble up, if I can put it that way, which were going to be researching climate, but with a particular emphasis on the relationship between carbon dioxide and temperature.
In 1988, at the request of Mrs. Thatcher, the UK Met Office set up a climate modelling unit which provided the basis for a new international committee called the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC.
They came out with the first big report which predicted climatic disaster as a result of global warming. I remember going to the scientific press conference and being amazed by two things. First, the simplicity and eloquence of the message and the vigour with which it was delivered. And secondly, the total disregard of all climate science up till that time, including, incidentally, the role of the sun, which had been the subject of a major meeting at the Royal Society just a few months earlier.
But the new emphasis on man-made carbon dioxide as a possible environmental problem didn't just appeal to Mrs. Thatcher.
It was certainly something very favourable to the environmental idea, what I call the medieval environmentalism of let's get back to the way things were in medieval times and get rid of all these dreadful cars and machines. They loved it because carbon dioxide was for them an emblem of industrialization.
Carbon dioxide clearly is an industrial gas and sort of tied in with economic growth, with transportation in cars, with what we call civilization. And there are forces in the environmental movement that are simply against economic growth. They think that's bad.
Patrick Moore is considered one of the foremost environmentalists of his generation. He is co-founder of Greenpeace.
The shift to climate being a major focal point came about for two very distinct reasons. The first reason was because by the mid-'80s, a majority of people now agreed with all of the reasonable things we in the environmental movement were saying they should do. Now, when a majority of people agree with you, it's pretty hard to remain confrontational with them. And so the only way to remain anti-establishment was to adopt ever more extreme positions. When I left Greenpeace, it was in the midst of them adopting a campaign to ban chlorine worldwide. Like I said, you guys, this is one of the elements in the periodic table, you know. I mean, I'm not sure if that's in our jurisdiction to be banning a whole element.
Destroying the wall were soon down.
The other reason that environmental extremism emerged was because world communism failed, the wall came down, and a lot of peaceniks and political activists moved into the environmental movement, bringing their neo-Marxism with them, and learned to use green language in a very clever way to cloak agendas that actually have more to do with anti-capitalism and anti-globalization than they do anything with ecology or science.
The left have been slightly disoriented by the manifest failure of socialism and indeed even more so of communism as it was tried out. And therefore they still remain as anti-capitalist as they were, but they have to find a new guise for their anti-capitalism.
And it was a kind of amazing alliance from Margaret Thatcher on the right through to very left-wing anti-capitalist environmentalists that created this kind of momentum behind a loony idea.
By the early 1990s, man-made global warming was no longer an eccentric theory about climate. It was a full-blown political campaign, attracting media attention and, as a result, more government funding.
Prior to Bush the Elder, I think the level of funding for climate and climate-related sciences was somewhere around the order of $170 million a year, which was reasonable for the size of the field, it jumped to 2 billion a year, more than a factor of 10. And yeah, that changed a lot. I mean,
that's a lot of jobs.
A lot of jobs. It brought a lot of new people into it who otherwise were not interested. So you developed whole cadres of people whose only interest in the field was that there was global warming.
If I wanted to do research on, shall we say, the squirrels of Sussex, what I would do, and this is any time from 1990 onwards, I would write my grant application saying, I want to investigate the nut-gathering behavior of squirrels with special reference to the effects of global warming. And that way I get my money. If I forget to mention global warming, I might not get the money.
We're all competing for funds. And if your field is the focus of concern, you have that much less work rationalizing why your field should be funded.
A large portion of government funds went into building computer models to forecast what the climate might do in the future. But how accurate are those models? Dr. Roy Spencer was Senior Scientist for Climate Studies at NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center. He has been awarded medals for exceptional scientific achievement from both NASA and the American Meteorological Society.
Climate models are only as good as the assumptions that go into them, and they have hundreds of assumptions. All it takes is one assumption to be wrong for the forecast to be way off.
All models assume that man-made CO2 is the main cause of climate change, rather than the sun or the clouds.
The analogy I use is like my car's not running very well, so I'm going to ignore the engine, which is the sun, and I'm going to ignore the transmission, which is the water vapor, and I'm going to look at one nut on the right rear wheel, which is the human-produced CO2. It's that, the science is that bad.
If you haven't understood all the components, the cosmic rays, the solar, the CO2, the water vapor, the clouds, and put it all together, if you haven't got all that, then your model isn't worth anything.
The range of climate forecasts varies greatly. These variations are produced by subtly altering the assumptions upon which the models are based.
I've worked with modelers, I've done modeling, and with a mathematical model and you tweak parameters, you can model anything. You can make it warmer, you can make it get colder by changing things.
To the untrained eye, computer models look impressive, and they give often wild speculation about the climate the appearance of rigorous science. They also provide an endless stream of spectacular stories for the media.
The thing that has amazed me as a lifelong journalist is how the most elementary principles of journalism seem to have been abandoned on this subject. You've got a whole new generation of reporters, environmental journalists. Now, if you're an environmental journalist, and if the global warming story goes in the trash can, so does your job. And the reporting has to get more and more hysterical because there are still, fortunately, a few hardened news editors around who will say, you know, this is what you were saying 5 years ago. Ah, but now it's much, much worse. You know, there's going to be 10 feet of sea level rise by next Tuesday or something. They have to keep on getting shriller and shriller and shriller.
It is now common in the media to lay the blame for every storm or hurricane on global warming. But is there any scientific basis for this?
This is purely propaganda. Every textbook in meteorology is telling you the main source of weather disturbances is the temperature difference between the tropics and the pole. And we're told in a warmer world, this difference will get less. Now that would tell you you'll have less storminess, you'll have less variability. But for some reason that isn't considered catastrophic. So you're told the opposite.
It is sometimes suggested that even a mild increase in global temperature could lead to a catastrophic melting of the polar ice caps. But what does Earth's climate history tell us?
We happen to have temperature records of Greenland that go back thousands of years. Greenland has been much warmer. Just 1,000 years ago, Greenland was warmer than it is today, yet it didn't have a dramatic melting event.
Even if we talk about something like permafrost, a great deal of the permafrost, that icy layer under the forests of Russia, for example, 7,000 or 8,000 years ago melted far more than we're having any evidence about it melting now. So in other words, this is a historical pattern again, but the world didn't come to a crunching halt because of it.
Professor Siunishi Akasofu is head of the International Arctic Research Center in Alaska, the world's leading Arctic research institute. Professor Akasofu insists that over time, the ice caps are always naturally expanding and contracting.
There are reports from time to time a big chunk of ice break away from the Antarctic continent. Those must have been happening all the time. But because now we have a satellite that can detect those, that's why they become the news. Practically all the TV programs that relate to global warming show big chunk of ice falling from the edge of the glaciers. But people forget that ice is always moving.
These data from NASA satellites show the huge natural expansion and contraction of the polar sea ice in the 1990s. News reports frequently show images of ice breaking from the edge of the Arctic. What they don't say is that this is as ordinary an event in the Arctic as falling leaves on an autumn day.
They ask me, did you see ice falling from the edge of the glaciers? Yes. That's the spring breakup. That's happened every year. Press come to us all the time, you know, I want to see something, the greenhouse disaster. I say there's none.
It is now common to blame changing sea levels in different parts of the world on climate. But how scientific is this?
Sea level changes over the world in general are governed fundamentally by two factors. What we would call local factors, the relationship of the sea to the land, which often, by the way, is to do with the land rising or falling than anything to do with the sea. But if you're talking about what we call eustatic changes of sea, worldwide changes of sea, that's through the thermal expansion of the oceans, nothing to do with melting ice. And that would take a very long time, more than your or my lifetime, even to be able to detect it.
It is also suggested that a rise in temperature will lead to the spread northward of deadly insect-borne tropical diseases like malaria. But is this true? Professor Paul Reiter of the Pasteur Institute in Paris is recognized as one of the world's leading experts on malaria and other insect-borne diseases. He is a member of the World Health Organization Expert Advisory Committee, was chairman of the American Committee of Medical Entomology of the American Society for Tropical Medicine, and lead author on the health section of the US National Assessment of the Potential Consequences of Climate Variability.
Mosquitoes are not specifically tropical. Most people will realize that in temperate regions there are mosquitoes. In fact, mosquitoes are extremely abundant in the Arctic. The most devastating epidemic of malaria was in the Soviet Union in the 1920s. There were something like 13 million cases a year and something like 600,000 deaths. A tremendous catastrophe that reached up to the Arctic Circle. Archangel had 30,000 cases and about 10,000 deaths. So it's not a tropical disease. Yet these people in the global warming fraternity invent the idea that malaria will move northwards.
Official reports issued by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change are often very alarming. But how reliable are they?
I was horrified to read the second and the third assessment reports because there was so much misinformation without any kind of recourse or virtually without mention of the scientific literature, the truly scientific literature, the literature by specialists in those fields.
In a letter to the Wall Street Journal, Professor Frederick Seitz, former president of America's National Academy of Sciences, revealed that IPCC officials had censored the comments of scientists. He said that
this report is not the version that was approved by the contributing scientists.
At least 15 key sections of the science chapter had been deleted. These included statements like,
none of the studies cited has shown clear evidence that we can attribute climate changes to increases in greenhouse gases. No study to date has positively attributed all or part of the observed climate changes to man-made causes.
Professor Seitz concluded,
I have never witnessed a more disturbing corruption of the peer review process than the events that led to this IPCC report.
In its reply, the IPCC did not deny making these deletions, but it said there was no dishonesty or bias in the report and that uncertainties about the cause of global warming had been included. The changes had been made, it said, in response to comments from governments, individual scientists and non-governmental organizations.
When I resigned from the IPCC, I thought that was the end of it. But when I saw the final draft, my name was still there, so I asked for it to be removed. Well, they told me that I had contributed, so it would remain there. So I said, no, I haven't contributed, because they haven't listened to anything I've said. So in the end, it was quite a battle. But finally, I threatened legal action against them, and they removed my name. And I think this happens a great deal. Those people who are specialists but don't agree with the polemic and resign, and there have been a number that I know of, they are simply put on the author list and become part of this 2,500 of the world's top scientists.
There is now a powerful institutional momentum behind the idea of man-made global warming. Here in Nairobi, dedicated civil servants, professional NGO campaigners, carbon offset fund managers, environmental journalists and others have gathered for a 10-day conference sponsored by the UN to discuss climate change. The number of delegates exceeds 6,000.
Where I live, we have a local council global warming officer. There's a huge tail out there of people who have, in one way or another, been recruited to join this particular bandwagon.
The billions of dollars invested in climate science means there is a huge constituency of people dependent upon those dollars. And they will want to see that carry forward. It happens in any bureaucracy.
Anybody who stands up and says, hey, wait a minute, let's look at this coolly and rationally and carefully and see actually how much merit, how much this stands up, they will be ostracized.
The old English saying, if you stand up in the coconut shy, they're going to throw at you. So I understand that there's going to be some of that, but it gets pretty difficult and pretty nasty and very personal. And there have been, death threats and all sorts of things, and so I'm not doing it for my health.
These days, if you are skeptical about the litany around climate change, you're suddenly like as if you're a Holocaust denier.
I'm certainly not the first or the last person to say that the whole global warming business has become like a religion. And people who disagree are called heretics. I'm a heretic. The makers of this program are all heretics.
The environmental movement, really, it is a political activist movement. And they have become hugely influential at a global level. And every politician is aware of that today. Whether you're on the left, in the middle, or the right, you have to pay homage to the environment.
The global warming campaign recently won a great victory. The United States government, once a bastion of resistance, has succumbed. George Bush is now an ally. Western governments have now embraced the need for international agreements to restrain industrial production in the developed and developing world. But at what cost? Paul Driesen is a former environmental campaigner.
My big concern with global warming is that the policies being pushed to supposedly prevent global warming are having a disastrous effect on the world's poorest people.
Global warming campaigners say it does no harm to be on the safe side. Even if the theory of man-made climate change is wrong, we should impose draconian measures to cut carbon emissions just in case. They call this the precautionary principle.
The precautionary principle is a very interesting beast. It's basically used to promote a particular agenda and ideology. It's always used in one direction only. It talks about the risks of using a particular technology, fossil fuels, for example, but never about the risks of not using it. It never talks about the benefits of having that technology.
Anne Muugela is about to cook a meal for her children. She is one of the 2 billion people, a third of the world's population, who have no access to electricity. Instead, they must burn wood or animal dung in their homes. The indoor smoke this produces is the deadliest form of pollution in the world. Nor do people like Anne have access to clean water. As a result, around 4 million children under the age of 5 die in poor countries each year from respiratory diseases and diarrhea.
If you were to ask a rural person to define development, they'll tell you, yes, I'll know I've moved to the next level when I have electricity. Actually, not having electricity creates such a long chain of problems because the first thing you miss is the light. So you get that they have to go to sleep earlier because there's no light. There's no reason to stay awake. I mean, you can't talk to each other in darkness.
No refrigeration or modern packaging means that food cannot be kept. A fire in the hut is too smoky and consumes too much wood to be used as heating. There is no hot water. We in the West cannot begin to imagine how hard life is without electricity. The life expectancy of people who live like this is terrifyingly short. Their existence impoverished in every way. A few miles away, the UN is hosting its conference on global warming in its plush gated headquarters. The gift shop is selling souvenirs of peasant tribal life, while delegates discuss how to promote what are described as sustainable forms of electrical generation. Africa has coal and Africa has oil, but environmental groups are campaigning against the use of these cheap sources of energy. Instead, they say Africa and the rest of the third world should use solar and wind power. A short drive out of Nairobi, we find our first solar panel. A Kenyan public health official has brought us to a clinic which serves several villages. The only electrical implements in the clinic are the electric lights and a refrigerator in which to keep vaccines, medicine and blood samples. Electricity is provided by 2 solar panels.
So what can it do successfully?
Lighting.
Lighting only?
Yes.
What happens when you put lighting plus the refrigerator and others? What happens?
It sounds an alarm.
It sounds an alarm?
Yeah.
Then can we maybe see that?
The solar panels allow Dr. Samuel Mwangi to use either the lights or the refrigerator, but not both at the same time. If he does, the electricity shuts down. Wind and solar power are notoriously unreliable as a source of electricity and are at least 3 times more expensive than conventional forms of electrical generation.
The question would be, how many people in Europe, how many people in the United States are already using that kind of energy? And how cheap is it? You see, if it's expensive for the Europeans, if it's expensive for the Americans, and we are talking about poor Africans, you know, it doesn't make sense. The rich countries can afford to engage in some luxurious experimentation with other forms of energy. But for us, we are still at the stage of survival.
To former environmentalist Paul Driesen, the idea that the world's poorest people should be restricted to using the world's most expensive and inefficient forms of electrical generation is the most morally repugnant aspect of the global warming campaign.
Let me make one thing perfectly clear. If we're telling the third world that they can only have wind and solar power, what we are really telling them is you cannot have electricity.
The challenge we have when we meet Western environmentalists who say we must engage in use of solar panels and wind energy is how we can have Africa industrialized. Because I don't see how a solar panel is going to power a steel industry, how a solar panel, is going to power maybe some railway train network. It might work maybe to power a small transistor radio. One clear thing that emerges from the whole environmental debate is the point that there's somebody keen to kill the African dream, and the African dream is to develop.
The environmental movement has evolved into the strongest force there is for preventing development in the developing countries.
We are being told, don't touch your resource, don't touch your oil, don't touch your coal. That is suicide.
I think it's legitimate for me to call them anti-human. Like, okay, you don't have to think humans are better than whales or better than owls or whatever if you don't want to, right? But surely it is not a good idea to think of humans as sort of being scum, that it's okay to have hundreds of millions of them go blind or die or whatever. I just can't relate to that.
The theory of man-made global warming is now so firmly entrenched, the voices of opposition so effectively silenced, it seems invincible, untroubled by any contrary evidence, no matter how strong. The global warming alarm is now beyond reason.
There will still be people who believe that this is the end of the world, particularly when you have, for example, the chief scientist of the UK telling people that by the end of the century, the only habitable place on the Earth will be the Antarctic. And humanity may survive thanks to some breeding couples who move to the Antarctic. I mean, it's hilarious. It would be hilarious, actually, if it weren't so sad.
What's tomorrow?